He wasn't supposed to find the dog. He wasn't supposed to find much of anything that winter. The ice on Stony Lake had gone gray and soft at the edges, and the birch trees along the north shore stood bare and indifferent against a sky the color of old pewter. Martin Hale had driven up to the cabin on a Thursday because he had no reason not to, and no reason to stay anywhere else. The truck needed new wiper blades. He kept forgetting to buy them. These were the kinds of thoughts that occupied a man when larger thoughts had become unbearable. Martin was 61 years old. He had spent 22 years as a Navy SEAL, done 3 deployments that he never discussed, and come home each time to the same woman, who had learned not to ask too many questions and had loved him anyway with a quiet, practical devotion that he had spent decades not fully appreciating. Her name had been Kathleen. She had died 14 months ago. A blood clot, the doctor said, as if naming it made it make sense. She had been hanging curtains in the kitchen. The curtains were still there. Martin had not gone back to the house in Pembroke since the funeral. The cabin had been Kathleen's idea years ago, and that was part of why he'd come. The other part was that he didn't know where else to go. He brought firewood up from the shed. He made instant coffee and stood at the window and watched the lake do nothing. He had done 3 tours in places where something was always happening, where the air itself seemed to vibrate with consequence, and now the greatest event of his morning was a chickadee, landing on the porch railing and leaving again. He did not know if that was peace or punishment. He suspected it was neither. He suspected it was just what happened when you ran out of war. He heard the dog on the second night. It was past midnight, and the wind had picked up off the water, rattling the old storm windows in their frames. Martin was not asleep. He rarely slept more than 4 hours, and those fitfully, and at first he thought the sound was the wind finding a new angle on the eaves. But wind didn't whimper. Wind didn't stop and start the way this sound did, ragged and deliberate, like something pushing the noise out because it had no other option. He pulled on his boots without lacing them and took the flashlight from the hook by the door. The dog was under the porch. It was a shepherd mix of some kind, mostly black with a tan chest, and it was wedged so far into the corner beneath the steps that Martin had to get down on one knee in the snow to see it properly. The beam of the flashlight caught 2 eyes reflecting back at him, very still, very watchful. The dog was not growling. It wasn't doing anything. It was simply existing in the smallest possible space it could find, which was something Martin understood better than he would have liked to admit. "All right," he said. He did not say anything else, because he wasn't sure what else there was to say. He went back inside and found a can of tuna in the cupboard and opened it and set it at the edge of the porch steps and went back to bed. In the morning, the can was empty and the dog was gone. He told himself that was fine. He told himself that again the next evening, when he found the dog sitting at the tree line 40 feet from the cabin, watching him split wood. It kept its distance with a kind of disciplined carefulness that struck him as oddly familiar. Not the behavior of an animal looking for handouts, the behavior of an animal assessing whether trust was survivable. Martin split 3 more logs and stacked them without looking at the dog directly. When he went inside, he left a bowl of water on the bottom step. The bowl was there in the morning, half empty, so it went for 4 days. The dog came closer by increments so small that Martin could almost convince himself nothing was changing. But he noticed. He was trained to notice things. Approaches, distances, the geometry of caution, and by the 5th morning the dog had moved from the tree line to the edge of the porch, and by the 6th it was sleeping against the exterior wall where the wood stove made the cabin siding warm. Martin began buying proper dog food at the hardware store in Tichborne, 14 kilometers down the road. The woman behind the counter, a heavy-set woman named Lois, who had apparently been the person to call about everything in this township for 30 years, looked at the bag and then at him and said, "Didn't know you had a dog up there." "I don't," Martin said. Lois looked at the bag again. "Not officially," he added, and she nodded as if this was a reasonable distinction. He was not a man who named things quickly. He had learned, in the particular way that the military teaches you without ever saying so directly, that naming things creates attachment, and attachment creates vulnerability, and vulnerability in the wrong moment gets people killed. He had tried to unlearn this after he came home for good, with limited success. Kathleen used to tease him about it. She had named every plant in the house. She had named the car. She had named a particularly aggressive squirrel that visited the backyard feeder, and she'd told Martin its whole backstory, as if she'd interviewed it personally. He had loved that about her. He had not told her so nearly enough. He called the dog Flint, not because he'd decided to, exactly, but because it arrived in his mind one morning when he was watching the dog pick its way carefully across the icy porch boards, testing each one, and the word just settled there and stayed, Flint. It suited him. Flint was dark and hard and cold on the outside and contained something combustible that you'd never know about unless you struck it right. The vet in Verona, Dr. Aldridge, a brisk, competent woman who looked at animals the way Martin had once looked at terrain, reading everything efficiently and without sentiment, said the dog was approximately 3 years old, male, moderately malnourished, with scarring on his left flank consistent with either a bite or a blade. His left ear had been partially torn and had healed crooked. He had been somebody's dog, Dr. Aldridge said at some point. Whether that had been good or bad for him was hard to say. He'll need another round of vaccinations in 3 weeks, she said, making a note. You planning to keep him? I haven't decided, Martin said. Dr. Aldridge looked at him over her glasses with the expression of a woman who had heard this particular sentence from too many people who then came back 3 weeks later, with a dog they had obviously decided to keep. Right, she said. We'll put you down for the appointment anyway. Martin paid and carried Flint to the truck. The dog allowed this without complaint, sitting in the passenger seat with the dignified composure of an animal that decided, provisionally, to extend some degree of trust, and drove back to the cabin in the beginning of a February snowfall that turned the highway quiet and soft. He did not go inside immediately. He sat in the parked truck with the engine ticking as it cooled, watching the snow come down on the lake, and Flint sat beside him doing the same, both of them looking out the windshield, at the white coming down. Martin thought about Kathleen. He thought about the curtains. He thought about the specific way she'd said his name when he came through the door after a long time away. Not excited, not performative, just solid and certain. The way a landmark sounds when someone names it. There, yes, that's where we are. He had not cried at the funeral. He had not cried since, except once at 3 a.m., in the parking lot of a Tim Hortons in Napanee. For no reason he could identify, and he'd stopped before it went anywhere, because an old habit dies hard, and the habit of not being broken in visible places dies hardest of all. Flint turned his head and looked at him, not with pity, which Martin could not have tolerated, not with the eager anxiety of a dog seeking reassurance, just with attention. The simple, uncomplicated attention of a creature who was here and had registered that Martin was here too, and found this neither alarming nor particularly complicated. They were both in the truck. The snow was coming down. These were the facts. Martin looked back at him. All right, he said for the second time since he'd found him. It was becoming a kind of vocabulary between them. He had spent years operating in teams. The particular closeness of men who have trusted each other with their lives, which is a closeness that has no civilian equivalent, and which leaves a specific kind of absence when it's gone. His closest friend from the teams, a man named Bowen, who was now an outfitter in northern BC, called once a month, and they spoke in the short, efficient way of men who don't need full sentences, and this was good, and Martin was glad for it. But it was not the same as presence. Nothing was the same as presence. Flint moved. Not much, just shifted his weight so that his shoulder was against Martin's arm. Just a few inches of warm pressure, deliberate and mild. It was such a small thing. Martin had been in the truck with the engine off for 11 minutes, in a temperature that was dropping, and he hadn't noticed until right then. He cleared his throat. He got out of the truck. Flint jumped down after him, and they walked to the cabin together through 3 inches of new snow, and Martin opened the door, and Flint went in first, and Martin stood in the doorway for a moment, looking out at the lake going white and silent in the dark, and then he went in too and shut the door. The cabin was warm. He fed the stove. He fed Flint. He made himself a proper dinner for the first time in a week. Nothing elaborate, just eggs, and the last of a block of cheddar, and some bread that was almost past its date, and ate it at the table rather than standing over the counter, which was what he'd been doing. He noticed he had done this. He noticed it the way you notice when a sound you've stopped registering as significant suddenly stops, and the absence of it makes you realize it had been there all along. In the weeks that followed, Flint complicated the cabin's silence in small, manageable ways. He was not a loud dog. He did not bark at nothing, did not demand attention, did not perform in the way that some animals perform, showing you their feelings like an invoice to be settled. He moved through the cabin with the same careful deliberateness with which he'd first moved across the ice, making sure of his footing, not expecting the ground to hold but willing to try. He did have opinions, though. Martin discovered this slowly. Flint had opinions about the hour of walks, which should be earlier than Martin preferred. He had opinions about the woodpile, which he inspected each morning with the gravity of a contractor reviewing work. He had opinions about the chair by the south-facing window, which he considered his, though he occasionally extended the courtesy of allowing Martin to use it. And he had opinions, most inconveniently, about when Martin had sat still long enough. Martin would be at the table with his coffee going cold, and his mind somewhere distant. A particular kind of distance that he recognized and mistrusted in himself. The kind where time moved strangely and the edges of things got unclear. And Flint would come and put his chin on the table and simply look at him, not asking for anything, not going anywhere, just being close enough that Martin had to return from wherever he'd gone. He mentioned this to Bowen in one of their monthly calls. "Dog's checking in on you," Bowen said. "He's a dog," Martin said. "Sure," Bowen said. "Doesn't mean he's wrong." There was a silence, the comfortable kind. "How's the shoulder?" Bowen asked. "Same," Martin said. "How are you?" Another silence, less comfortable. Martin looked at Flint, who was lying in the patch of afternoon light by the door, one ear tracking the call. "Getting there," Martin said. Bowen didn't push. That was the thing about Bowen. He'd seen enough of the inside of men's silences to know when one was collapsing and when it was just structural. "Good," he said. "That's good." March came, and with it the first tentative suggestion of thaw. The ice began to pull away from the shore in slivers. Martin started taking longer walks, out along the old logging road that ran north from the cabin, and through a stretch of mixed bush that opened eventually onto a ridge with a view across two lakes. Flint walked beside him or slightly ahead, nose working steadily, checking the world for information and reporting nothing urgent. The world was, by and large, fine. That was Flint's assessment. Martin was starting to think he might be right. He thought about Kathleen often, but differently. In the early months after she died, thinking about her had felt like pressing a bruise, a compulsive, self-punishing reflex, the mind returning to the source of pain the way a tongue finds a sore tooth. He hadn't been able to stop it, and he hadn't known how to do anything with it. The grief had nowhere to go. It sat in him like water in a sealed vessel, pressing against every surface with nowhere to drain. Now sometimes he thought about her and it was simply her. The way she made coffee, too strong, always. She said his had no character. The sound of her laughing at her own jokes before she'd finished telling them. The way she had looked at him on their last evening together, across the kitchen, while the curtains she'd just hung moved in the draft from the open window, and she'd said, somewhat randomly, "I like this house. I've always liked this house," and he'd said something unremarkable in return, some agreement, because he had not known it was the last evening, and so had not known to pay better attention. He had replayed that evening 10,000 times, trying to find something he'd missed, something that would mean he had been fully present. He couldn't find it. He had been partly elsewhere, the way he'd been partly elsewhere for significant portions of his adult life, and this was the true cost of it, the one that no debrief covers. He was on the ridge one afternoon in late March, when Flint went still, not the alert stillness of a dog that has spotted something across a field, a different quality of stillness. He was standing just behind Martin's left side, not quite touching him, and Martin felt it before he turned around. A kind of steadiness at his shoulder, something there. He'd felt it before. In the team sometimes, in the particular silence before a situation clarified itself, you would feel the man beside you settling into his own weight, becoming certain without words, just there, just committed. It was a form of communication that predated language. He turned and looked at Flint. Flint looked back at him. Martin had been crying, he realized. He hadn't noticed. He'd been looking out across the frozen lakes and thinking about Kathleen hanging curtains, and the tears had come quietly and without asking permission, and Flint had moved close without making anything of it. He wasn't trying to fix anything, he was just there. Martin sat down in the snow on the ridge, and Flint folded himself down beside him, and for a while they both looked out at the same view. 2 lakes, spruce and cedar going down the far slope, the sky beginning to soften toward evening. Martin put his hand on the dog's side, felt him breathe. He had told a grief counselor in Pembroke, back in the bleak autumn after Kathleen died, that he didn't know how to want things anymore. Not badly things, small things. The counselor had said that was common, that grief narrowed the aperture through which a person perceived the future. And Martin had thought this was accurate but not useful, the way many accurate things are not useful. He couldn't apply it. He didn't know what to do with a named thing that he couldn't act on. But sitting on the ridge with Flint breathing under his hand, he noticed that he wanted it to keep being tomorrow. Not fiercely, not urgently, just with a quiet, particular preference. He wanted to be here tomorrow. He wanted to take Flint on this same walk. He wanted to see whether the ice was off the lake by April, and he wanted Flint there when it happened. It was small. It was enough. Spring arrived the way it does in eastern Ontario, not gracefully but insistently, mud and melt, and a chaos of birdsong that seemed aggressive after the winter's quiet. The logging road turned to soup. Flint adopted the look of a dog who found mud professionally interesting and personally acceptable, which meant Martin's porch, and then his floors, required a degree of maintenance he had not anticipated. He did not particularly mind. He called his daughter in April. Her name was Renata, and she lived in Halifax with her husband and their 2 children. And she had been trying to reach him with the careful, patient persistence of someone who has decided that waiting is better than pushing. She had left messages he had not answered. She had sent a card at Christmas that he'd read and set on the mantel and looked at in his peripheral vision for 3 weeks. He called her on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting on the porch steps in the first real warmth of the season, with Flint beside him investigating a stick. "Dad," she said, and there was so much in that single syllable, relief and worry and effort not to make him feel either of those things, that he had to take a breath. "I'm here," he said. "I'm all right." "I know," she said, which was not the same as believing it, but she let it stand. He told her about Flint. He described the night under the porch, the bowl of tuna, the incremental approach, and Renata listened without interrupting, which was something she had always done. A gift he recognized now that he'd been starved of good listening. When he finished, there was a short pause. "You named him Flint," she said. "Yes. Mom would have named him something terrible," she said. "Something like Biscuit." "She would have named him after a historical figure," Martin said. "She would have called him Churchill." Renata laughed, her mother's laugh exactly, the kind that started before she was ready, and Martin felt something in his chest that had been held very tightly for a very long time shift, not break, not open, but move. Just move. "Can we come up in July?" Renata asked. "The kids want to see the lake." "Yes," he said. He had not meant to say it quite so quickly. "Yeah?" She sounded careful. "Yes," he said again. "There's room. Flint will need to meet them anyway." He didn't know why he'd added that, except that it was true. Flint was part of what was here now. Flint was part of what the cabin had become, which was something it hadn't been before, not just a place he was staying, but a place he was. That evening he walked down to the dock and stood at the end of it, and looked at the lake, which had been clear of ice for 2 weeks now, and was the particular deep green it goes in spring, before summer turns it blue. Flint stood beside him and looked out at the same water. There was a beaver working somewhere further along the shore. Martin could hear it, a small industry, quiet and consistent, doing what it was built to do. He thought about what Bowen had said, dogs checking in on you. He thought about all the times Flint had moved close without making it a thing, at the table, in the truck, on the ridge. The dog had no concept of what Martin had been through, no access to the specific geography of his grief, no knowledge of Kathleen or the curtains or the 22 years or any of it. He only knew that Martin was there, and that sometimes there was something wrong, and that the correct response was to be close. Martin had trained with men who operated by the same instinct. He had been one of them. The teams had their own language of presence, their own vocabulary of showing up, and it had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with commitment to the person beside you. He had thought, when he came home for the last time, that he'd left that behind, that it belonged to that life and not to this one. He looked at Flint. Flint looked at the lake. Martin had been wrong about that. The thing itself, the showing up, the staying close, the choosing to be present with someone in the difficult hours, that wasn't military. That was just the best thing that people and animals do, when they do it, when they're able. Kathleen had done it for 31 years. The men in his unit had done it. And now this dog who had been hurt by someone and had nevertheless decided, incrementally and with appropriate caution to try again, was doing it. He owed it something. He owed it more than that. He owed it the same thing back. The evening light went pink over the far shore, and the beaver was still working, and Flint pressed against his leg in that easy, authoritative way he had, and Martin stood at the end of the dock until the sun was almost gone. He had not planned to stay past March. He had not planned much of anything, but the appointment with Dr. Aldridge was on the calendar, and Renata was coming in July. And there was a section of the dock that needed new boards before summer, and Flint had a preferred trail, and a particular patch of sunlight in the cabin, and a bowl with his name on it. And these were small things, and they were everywhere now, and they added up to something that felt, cautiously and without exaggeration, like a life. It wasn't what it had been. It was never going to be what it had been, but it was his, and it was here, and tomorrow he would walk the logging road again, and Flint would be ahead of him on the trail, checking the world for information, and the world, most likely, would again be fine. That was enough to walk toward.